Hi everyone, I'm Tilo Matthews, Product Manager and Open Source Lead at ResearchSpace. I'm sorry I can't be with you in person today, but I'm happy to take any questions about our story, taking RSpace from a closed source product to fully open source next time we meet or asynchronously. I started at ResearchSpace with the task of taking RSpace to open source, and at first didn't expect this to be that unconventional. But as soon as I started my early investigations, I quickly learned that going from closed to open isn't exactly common. But for us as an organization, it has been a natural extension of how we've always approached product development. I'll start with a brief introduction about what RSpace actually is and what it helps with. Then we'll dive into our open source journey, the approach we took, and the challenges we faced, and I'll wrap up with what's coming next. So, what is RSpace? We see it as an open source research platform for institutional research data management. Researchers use it mainly in the active research phase, and at its core, RSpace provides an electronic research or lab notebook combined with sample management. If you look at the graphic here, you can see that RSpace was built for vertical interoperability. It connects with other research tools and infrastructure across the research data lifecycle through integrations, open APIs, and SDKs. The integrations cover everything from protocols and instruments, remote file storage, data management tools, computational tools, and repositories. This ecosystem obviously didn't happen overnight, but it shows how RSpace evolved from being just an electronic lab notebook to a hub for recording the scientific process and for fueling a fair data ecosystem. So, what does RSpace actually help with? Well, it depends on who you ask. For researchers, it's about focusing on their actual research while still complying with research data management mandates, which to many can sometimes feel like competing priorities. Research data management professionals, on the other hand, can support researchers in their native environment and create fair workflows that actually stick, reducing overhead rather than adding to it. At the organizational level, it enables adoption of fair practices at scale in a cost-efficient and cost-saving way, ultimately increasing the impact of research and innovation. But really, at the end of the day, it's all about accelerating research and innovation for everyone, and that innovation includes the continuous development of our space, which is by now open source, and by that, also its ecosystem. But how did we get there? As I mentioned in the beginning, at ResearchSpace, open source isn't separate from how we think about product development. To us, it's an extension of how we already operate. What you're seeing here is an older graphic that we use to picture our product development approach. From collaboration with universities and their researchers, we identify general and tailored improvement opportunities. From collaborating with tool partners and their communities, we share innovation and create streamlined workflows. All of this feeds into the continuous evolution of the RSpace ecosystem, which then leads to improved research workflows, ultimately addressing our users' and customers' needs. This collaborative and iterative approach was already part of our organization's DNA before we went open source. It just felt natural to extend this model formally into the open. The journey itself started quite a while back. In 2017, ResearchSpace already open-sourced the RSpace repository code as part of a collaboration with the Dataverse community, so there was already some precedent there. Then between 2020 and 2022, we noticed the emergence of open-source electronic lab notebooks in Europe, and our customers started suggesting this was a good model for us to follow as well. Around 2021-2022, we began developing integrations with further open-source solutions, like iRods, Omero, and Nextcloud. We already concluded that open source was the way to go before, but finally, by 2023, we committed to going open and began the detailed exploration of how the transition could actually work in practice. And then in June 2024, so about 16 months ago, RSpace was officially released as an open source project. The transition itself required answering a fundamental question: what is the right open source model for our space and for our organization? To answer that, we had to consider several things. First, balancing our needs as an organization to stay sustainable with the needs of the community. We reviewed our internal operations and processes and how they might look like going forward. We had to review our software inventory. What's in the code base? What dependencies we have? How might this limit our ability to choose an open source license? What might be blocking us from going open source? And lastly, we had to review our commercial services. How do we sustain this as a business? The challenges were manifold. First, closed to open source transitions are just not very common. There aren't any playbooks for this. Secondly, RSpace is a large software project. It's not a small tool, and it's been developed over many years, which means there's a lot of accumulated complexity and history to deal with. Lastly, we had to plan to externalize and, to some degree, replace previous commercial third-party components, making sure we weren't including anything in the open source release that we didn't have the rights to share, but at the same time making sure the open source version doesn't lack any fundamental functionality. So here's where we ended after we did internal consultations and discussing with our existing network of customers and collaborators. We licensed RSpace under AGPL v3, and that choice was deliberate. We wanted to ensure that the code remains open, so any modifications or derivative works also need to be open source. It felt like the right fit for what we're trying to achieve. ResearchSpace, as a company, is the maintainer of the project, operating as an organizational benevolent dictator for the project. ResearchSpace provides services around implementation, adoption, customization, and maintenance. That's our business model. For the time being, we're focusing on extending how we work with our current customers and partner communities in co-developing solutions. This will now include onboarding institutional and tool research software engineers to be able to contribute to the project. Additionally, we enabled contribution workflows for individual contributors. Whether it's pitching ideas, sharing feedback and experiences, contributing code, or supporting the community in other ways, there are multiple entry points we established from the start. On the project infrastructure side, everything lives under the RSpace OS GitHub organization, which already contained previously open-sourced projects. Formerly closed source code has been added to this GitHub organization, including a new RSpace Docker repository for containerized deployment to allow folks to quickly try out RSpace. We have documentation split between product documentation, which remains on the prior location and isn't directly on GitHub at this point, and developer documentation, which is. To wrap it all up, there's a wiki on GitHub serving as a starting point for getting to know the project and how it operates. The wiki also includes a section for acknowledging and highlighting community projects. And we're using GitHub projects for our public roadmap and issue tracker. We still have internal project management tools at this point, but we aim to migrate those operations over gradually. Finally, as of this year, we've started bi-monthly community meetings. These are open to anyone interested in RSpace and an opportunity to showcase their projects, ask questions, find collaboration opportunities, and more. At the same time, we also have local interest groups starting organically, such as a yearly German administrator meetup. One of the first things we did before going open source was drafting our contribution guidelines. We have a code of conduct and contributor guidelines. Besides a general call to reach out to the core team before starting any major code contribution for alignment purposes, we also decided to require a contributor license agreement for code contributions. The CLA is one of those things we had to put in place to clarify IP and rights. I know CLAs can sometimes be a barrier, but for us as an organization providing services to other organizations, it is necessary to manage IP and rights to ensure we can continue to maintain and develop the project sustainably. The CLA process is automatized using GitHub Actions to reduce the friction of signing. The contributing guidelines additionally outline further types of contributions, bug reports and feature requests through our issue forms, and security vulnerability reports through a process illustrated in our security.md, which is not using GitHub's security advisory workflows. We've just recently added UX design and research as a formal contribution type, which I'm personally quite excited about because good UX is so critical for the adoption of research tools. We still need to provide more reference material, such as extensive style guides and more key workflow descriptions for efficient onboarding of UX contributors. For anything else that doesn't fit these categories, there's contact information on our wiki, and we encourage folks to reach out with their ideas. So, we have much in place already, but there are lots of opportunities to support and grow the community around RSpace. Since we're a small team with many responsibilities, we do have to focus. Right now, our priority is extending on how we collaborate with current institutional partners, tool providers and communities, and RDM communities more broadly. I am personally keen to facilitate non-code contributions, things like UX work, creating templates for different research domains, documentation improvements, and other ways people can get involved without necessarily writing code. On the longer horizon, as I mentioned already, we as the ResearchSpace team are working towards operating gradually more in public through our GitHub presence. So that's where we are. It's been and still is an interesting journey, and we're still figuring things out as we go. So we're excited to be part of the Birdaro program to learn from you all. Again, sorry I couldn't be there in person today. Would have loved to directly discuss with you all, but if you're interested in chatting about our open source journey or RSpace in general, please reach out to me. Here's the team that's made this happen. You can see we've got folks across product, design, development, operations, and support all working on this together. And if we haven't met in person yet, I'd love to meet you at a future event. We maintain a list of where we'll be on our website. Thanks for watching, and feel free to reach out with any questions.